Chapter 65, The Wrongs and Crimes of the Poor. The parlor of the dark house was, as usual, filled with a very tolerable sprinkle of customers. One would have thought, to look at their beards, that there was not a barber in the whole district of the Tower hamlets, and yet it appears to be a social peculiarity that the lower the neighborhood, the more numerous the shaving shops. Amongst the very rich classes, nobles and gentlemen are shaved by their valets. The males of the middle grade shave themselves, and the men of the lower orders are shaved at barber shops. Hence the immense number of party-colored poles projecting over the pavement of miserable and dirty streets, and the total absence of those signs in wealthy districts. It's an interesting look at Victorian London, right? The guests in the dark parlor formed about as pleasant an assemblage of scamps as one could wish to behold. The establishment was a notorious resort for thieves and persons of the worst character, and no one who frequented it thought it worthwhile to shroud his real occupation beneath an air of false modesty. The conversation in the parlor therefore usually turned upon the tricks and exploits of the thieves frequenting the place, and many entertaining autobiographical sketches were in this way delivered. In one corner sat the Resurrection Man and the Cracksman, each with a smoking glass of gin and water before him. They mingled but little in the conversation, contenting themselves with laughing and approval of anything good that fell upon their ears, and listening to the discourse that took place around them. "Now, come tell us, Joe," said a woman with eyes like saucers, hair like a bundle of tow, and teeth like dominoes, and addressing herself to a man who was dressed like a coal heaver. "Tell us, Joe, how you come to be a prig." "Ah, do, Joe, there's a good feller," echoed a dozen voices, male and female. "It's simple enough," cried the man thus appealed to. "Every poor devil must become a thief in time." "That's what you say, Tony," whispered the Cracksman to the Resurrection Man. "Of course he must," continued the Coal Heaver, more particular them as follows my old trade, for though I've got on the togs of a whipper, I ain't one no longer. The dress is convenient, that's all." "The blue bottles don't twig, eh?" cried the woman with the domino teeth. "That's it. But you asked me how I come to be a prig. I'll tell you. My father was a coal whipper and had 3 sons. He brought us all up to be coal whippers also. My eldest brother was drowned in the pool one night when he was drunk, after only drinking about 2 pots of the publican's beer. My other brother died of hunger in Coldbath Fields Prison, where he was sent for 3 months for taking home a bit of coal one night to his family when he couldn't get his wages paid him by the publican that hired the gang in which he worked. My father died when he was 40, and anyone have seen him would have fancied he was 65 at least, so broke down was he with hard work and drinking. But no coal whipper lives to an old age. They all die off at about 40, old men in the very prime of life." "And why is that?" demanded the large-toothed lady. "Why not?" repeated the man. "Because a coal whipper isn't a human being, or if he is, he isn't treated as such, and so I've always thought he must be different from the rest of the world." "How isn't he treated like anyone else?" "In the first place, he doesn't get paid for his labor in a proper way. Wapping swarms with low public houses, the landlords of which act as middlemen between the owners of the colliers and the men that are hired to unload them. A coal whipper can't get employment direct from the captain of the collier. The working of the collier is farmed by them landlords I speak of, and the whipper must apply to their houses. Those whippers as drinks the most always gets employment first, and whether a whipper chooses to drink beer or not, it's always sent 3 times a day on board the colliers for the gangs, and my eye, what stuff it is. Often and often we have throwed it away because we couldn't possibly drink it. And it must be odd liquor that a coal whipper won't drink." "I should think so too, but go on." "Well, I used to earn from 15 to 18 shillings a week, and out of that 8 was always stopped up for the beer. And if I didn't spend another or 2 on Saturday night when I received the balance, the landlord set me down as a stingy fella and put a cross against my name in his book." "What was that for?" "Why, not to give me any more work till he was either forced to do so for want of hands, or I made it up with him by standing a crown bowl of punch. So with what one thing and another, I had to keep myself, my wife, and 3 children on about 7 or 8 shillings a week after working from light to dark." So their job is to unload the coal that comes from the colliers into the public houses. But they had to be hired by the public houses, who wouldn't hire anyone who wouldn't spend most of what they made in their pub drinking. So it was this unending cycle of reinforced poverty. And now your wife and children is better paraded for it, said the woman with the huge teeth. Yes, indeed, in the workhouse, answered the man sharply. So now you see what a coal whipper's life is. He can't be a sober man if he wishes to, because he must pay for a certain quantity of drink, and so of course he won't throw it away unless it's so bad he can't keep it on his stomach. And was that often the case? Often and often. Well, he can't be a saving man because he has no chance of getting his wages under his own management. He is the publican's slave, the publican's tool and instrument. No tyranny is equal to the tyranny of them publicans. And why isn't the plan altered? Why? What do the owners of the colliers or the people that the cargo's consigned to care about the poor devils that unload it? The publicans takes the unloading on contract and employs the whippers in such a way as to get an enormous profit. Talk of appealing to the owners, what do they care? There has been meetings got up to change the system, and what's the consequence? Why, them whippers as attended them became marked men, never got no more employment, and drowned themselves in despair or turned prigs like me. That's better than suicide. Well, I don't know now, but them meetings as I was a-speaking of got up deputations to the Court of Aldermen, and the matter was referred to the Coal and Corn Committee, and there was, as usual, a great talk, but nothing done. Then an application was made to some minister, I don't know which, and he sent back a letter with a seal as big as a crown piece, just to say that he'd received the application and would give it his earliest attention. Some time passed away, and no more notice was ever taken of it in that quarter. And I suppose a minister's earliest attention means 10 or a dozen years. What a shame to treat people so. It's only the poor that's treated so. And now I think I have said enough to show why I turned prig. Like many more whippers from the port of London, there isn't a more degraded, oppressed, and brutalized set of men in the world than the whippers. They are born with examples of drunken fathers afore their eyes, and drunken fathers makes drunken mothers, and drunken parents make sons turn out thieves, and daughters prostitutes. And that is the existence of the coal whippers of Wapping. It ain't their fault. They haven't education and self-command to refuse the drink that's forced upon them and that they must pay for. And their sons and daughters shouldn't be blamed for turning out bad. How can they help it? And yet one reads in the papers that the upper classes is always a-crying out about the dreadful immorality of the poor. The laws, you see, Tony, whispered the cracksman to his companion. Of course, answered the Resurrection Man. Here we are in this room, upwards of 20 thieves and prostitutes. I'll be bound to say that the laws and the state of society made 18 of them what they are. Nobody knows the miseries of a coal whipper's life, continued the orator of the evening, but him that's Bennett hisself. He is always dirty, always lurking about public houses when not at work, always ready to drink, always in debt, and always dissatisfied with his own way of living, which isn't, however, his fault. There's no hope for coal whippers or their families. The sons that don't turn out thieves must lead the same terrible life of cart-horse labor and constant drinking, with the certainty of dying old men at 40. And the daughters that don't turn out prostitutes marry whippers and draw down upon their heads all the horrors and sorrows of the life I have been describing. Well, I never knowed this before. No, and there's a deal of misery of each kind in London that isn't known to them as dwells in the other kinds of wretchedness. And if these things gets represented in Parliament, the cry is, oh, the people's always complaining. They're never satisfied. Well, you speak of each person knowing his own species of misery and being ignorant of the nature of the misery next door, said a young and somewhat prepossessing woman, upon whose face intemperance and licentiousness had made sad havoc. All I can say is that people see girls like us laughing and joking always in public, but they little know how we weep and mourn in private. Drink gin then as I do, cried the woman with the large teeth. Ah, you know well enough, continued the young female who had previously spoken, that we do drink a great deal too much of that. My father used to get Jigger Gin in George Hall, Whitechapel. And what the devil is Jigger Gin? Demanded one of the male guests. It is made from molasses, beer, and vitriol. Everyone knows what Jigger Gin is. 3 wine glasses of it will make the strongest man mad drunk. I'll tell you one thing, continued the young woman, which you do not seem to know, and that is that the very, very poor, who are driven almost to despair and suicide by their sorrows, are glad to drink this Jigger Gin, which is all that they can afford. For 3 halfpence they may have enough to send them raving, and then what do they think or care about their miseries? Ah, very true, said the coal whipper. I've heard of this before. Well, my father sold that horrid stuff, resumed the young woman, and though he was constantly getting into trouble for it, he didn't mind. But the moment he came out of prison, he took to his old trade again. I was his only child, and my mother died when I was about 9 years old. She was always drunk with the Jigger Gin, and one day she fell into the fire and was burned to death. I had no one then who cared anything for me, but used to run about in the streets with all the boys in the neighborhood. My family took in lodgers, and 16 or 17 of us, boys and girls all huddled together, used to sleep in one room, not near so big as this. There was 15 lodging houses of the same kind in George Yard at that time, and it was supposed that about 275 persons used to sleep in those houses every night, male and female lodgers all pigging together. Every sheet, blanket, and bolster in my father's house was marked with "Stop Thief" in large letters. Well, at 11 years old, I went up to the town, and if I didn't bring home as much money every Saturday night to my father, I used to be well thrashed with a rope's end on my bare back. But I was doomed, it seemed, continued the young woman, to live in this horrible manner. When I was 13 or 14, my father died, and I was then left to shift for myself. I moved down into Wapping and frequented the long rooms belonging to the public houses there. I was then pretty well off because the sailors that went to these places always had plenty of money and was very generous. But I was one night suspected of hawkessing and robbing a sailor, and though if I was on my deathbed I could swear that I never had any hand in the affair at all, I was so blown upon that I was forced to shift my quarters. So I went to a dress house in Ada Street, Hackney Road. All the remuneration I received there was board and lodging, and I was actually a slave to the old woman that kept it. I was forced to walk the streets at night with a little girl following me to see that I did not run away. And all the money I received I was forced to give up to the old woman. While I was there, several other girls were turned out of doors and left to die in ditches or on dunghills because they were no longer serviceable. All this frightened me, and then I was so ill-used and more than half-starved, I was forced to turn out in all weathers, wet or dry, hot or cold, well or ill. Sometimes I have hardly been able to drag myself out of bed with sickness and fatigue, but no matter, out I must go. The rain perhaps pouring in torrents, or the roads knee-deep in snow, and nothing but a thin cotton gown to wear. Winter and summer, always flaunting dresses, yellow, green, and red, wet or dry, always silk stockings and thin shoes, cold or warm, with strict orders not to fasten the miserable scanty shawl over my bosom. And then the little girl that followed me about was a spy with wits as sharp as needles. Impossible to deceive her. At length I grew completely tired of this kind of life, and so I gave the little spy the slip one fine evening. I was then 16, and I came back to this neighborhood. But one day I met the old woman who kept the dress house, and she gave me in charge for stealing wearing apparel, the clothes I had on my back when I ran away from her. Always the police, the police, the police, when the poor and miserable are concerned, whispered the resurrection man to the cracksman. But did the inspector take the charge? Demanded the coal heaver. He not only took the charge, answered the unfortunate girl, but the magistrate next morning committed me for trial, although I proved to him that the clothes were bought with the wages of my own prostitution. Well, I was tried at the Central Criminal Court, and of course acquitted. No, found guilty. What, by an English jury? I can show you the newspaper. I have kept the report of the trial ever since. Then things are 1,000 times worse than I thought they was, said the coal whipper, striking his clenched fist violently upon the table at which he was seated. But the jury recommended me to mercy, continued the unfortunate woman, and so the recorder only sentenced me to 21 days' imprisonment. His lordship also read me a long lecture about the errors of my ways and advised me to enter upon a new course of life, but he did not offer to give me a character, nor did he tell me how I was to obtain honest employment without one. That's the way with them beaks, cried one of the male inmates of the parlor. They can talk for an hour, but supposing you'd say to the recorder, "My lord, will your wife take me into her service as a scullery girl?" he would have stared in astonishment at your impertinence. When I got out of prison, resumed the girl, who was thus sketching the adventures of her wretched life, I went into Great Titchfield Street. My new abode was a dress house kept by French people. Every year the husband went over to France and returned with a famous supply of French girls, and in the meantime his wife decoyed young Englishwomen up from the country under pretense of obtaining situations as nursery governesses and ladies' maids for them. Many of these poor creatures were the daughters of clergymen and half-pay officers in the Marines. The moment a new supply was obtained by these means, circulars was sent round to all the persons that was in the habit of using the house, different sums, from 20 to 100 pounds. Ah, I understand, said the coal whipper, but did you ever hear say how many unfortunate gals there was in London? 80,000. From Titchfield Street I went into the Almonry, Westminster. The houses there are all occupied by fences, prigs, and gals of the town. And the parsons of Westminster Abbey, who is the landlords of the house, does nothing to put him down, said the coal whipper. Not a bit, echoed the young woman with a laugh. We had capital fun in the house where I lived, dog fighting, badger baiting, and drinking all day long. The police never visits the almonry. And of course not, because it's the property of the parsons. They wouldn't be so rude. The coarse jest was received with a shout of laughter, and the health of the dean and the chapter of Westminster was drunk amidst uproarious applause by the thieves and women assembled in the dark parlor. Scarcely was the laughter promoted by this sally beginning to subside when a short, thick-set, middle-aged man, enveloped in a huge great coat with most capacious pockets at the sides, entered the parlor, took his seat near the door, and called for a glass of hot gin and water. Okay, that's the end of the chapter. So this was another one where I don't know if that information is actually going to play a role in the book moving forward, or if it was more of the author allowing a glimpse into the lives of the poor and the destitute to his readers who maybe haven't experienced it, as well as offering a bit of acknowledgement and solidarity to his lower class readers who were struggling with these very things. A way of saying, I see you, I see what you're going through, I see what you're experiencing. So there you go. We don't know who this person is who just arrived, but obviously they're going to be significant or they wouldn't be the very last thing that the author mentioned at the end of the chapter. So there we are. We still don't know what Richard's scheme is, and if Harry Halford's going to help him out. We're not sure what the Resurrection Man and the Cracksman are up to next and what they're going to be taking on. We don't know if Eliza made it to Italy safely. We don't know if Isabella really is safe from George Montague Greenwood. We don't know. We'll see what happens next time.